And my guest today, I am super excited to have this guy. I really like what he's doing. He is a writer. He has written the novels. His novels include Bash Bash Revolution, Billy Moon, and After the Saucers Landed. He works at Zero Books, which is a cool publisher based in the UK, actually, but they also got presence here in the United States of America, and he hosts the Zero Squared podcast. Please welcome to the show, Douglas Lain. Douglas, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for being here. I'm excited to talk to you. So we'll get right into it. I've watched a lot of the interviews that you've been in. So I've heard some of your thoughts out there. You said this in an interview, and it really struck me. You said that in 2008, when pretty much the financial collapse happened and the housing market went to garbage, you looked around and you kind of thought, hey, the Marxists were right. Can you embellish on that? Like, what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, it wasn't like I looked around immediately and realized it. It was a process. In fact, I started to podcast on my own. I mean, now I podcast for Zero Books, but I used to do it on my own. And I was podcasting partly to try to discover just what was going on. It seemed cataclysmic. The 2008 crisis seemed very threatening. At the time, I was working for Comcast in a job that I really hated. I was in a phone center making calls, and it felt like my prospects for other possibilities of employment were dwindling as the economy was dropping. I had a Billy Moon, that first novel that you mentioned, was like in the works, and at the same time, like half of New York publishing were fired around 2008. So it was like I felt like maybe this writing career that I had been pursuing wasn't going to come to fruition because of the economic crisis as well. And I really wanted to know just why it had happened and what we could expect to come out of it. I was already far on the left. I was like a Chomsky anarchist type. You know, I'd read Adbusters magazine and go to protests against U.S.
You were already on a list somewhere. You were already
I was already on a list, but I wasn't a Marxist because I'm probably a bit older than most of the people on the left now. I mean, I definitely am. I need to accept how old I am. I'm like Jimmy Dore here. I'm in my late 40s, and so I was raised. I came up in a time when the Cold War was still going on. And Marx was just off the table. You just didn't, you might say, because I was sort of an anarchist type in the Pacific Northwest. So you might say, oh, yeah, Marx had some good critiques of capitalism, but he was an authoritarian and he was nasty and we don't really look at him. But I started podcasting and inviting economists on, left economists on, to try to figure out what was going on with the economic crisis. And it was that process of interviewing a bunch of people over a few years that transformed me into kind of a rad lib anarchist, into what I called for a long time and still say occasionally is a wannabe Marxist. So what that means is I'm not done reading Marx. I'm not done trying to understand the Marxist project.
There's a lot of volumes.
Yeah.
There's a lot of volumes to Capital.
Yeah, I've read Capital Volume 1 and not 2 and 3. I shouldn't confess this on the air, but it's a fact. And I've read a bunch of other Marxist texts, and I'm slowly kind of continuing my education to try to figure out just what the socialist project is, what the history of socialism is, and how it's become distorted over time as well.
So what specifically, when it came to housing, like what were those lefty economists saying where you were like, oh, yeah, this is what we should be doing?
Well, the main thing that I became convinced about wasn't so much about the incidents that sparked the recession or almost depression, the economic crisis of 2008, but the theories or the explanations of the underlying causes. So what I became convinced of was that there's a tendency for the rate of profit to decline as we innovate in a capitalist economy, that the speed up of production actually works against itself overall. And as the commodities become cheaper, the profitability goes down, which can lead to a variety of things. It's led to lots of attempts to compensate for instance, financialization, or other kinds of speculative bubbles. But nonetheless, that is the inherent weakness of a capitalist economy, is that it is crisis prone because it has a tendency to turn its success into its failure. And then, unfortunately for us, also to turn its failure into success. When you have a massive depression, capital becomes cheaper, and reinvestment and profitability becomes more of a possibility. So it's not that the capitalist economy will go into some sort of terminal crisis and then we'll get socialism. It's that basically it will go into crisis, and then there'll be a boom, and then there'll be a crisis, and the human beings suffer, but the capitalist economy is just operating like it should. That's
Yeah.
that's how it works.
Well, and a few people at the top never suffer, and so the process continues, and it's one of those things, like when you really take a step back and you realize, oh, we made an entire economy based on consumption, not consumption out of necessity, not even consumption out of necessity and for a quality of life, which there's nothing wrong with either of those things. Both those things are good things. But consumption out of this is how the economy works, that takes it to a whole other level, and it's just inherently going to self-destruct every so often.
One of the things about reading Marx and becoming a Marxist is that you become, in my case, a reluctant pedant. So I want to say that it's not a matter of our economy isn't primarily based on consumption, but on exchange. Because when you think about consumption, most of the time people think about, individuals, workers going to the store and buying things that they then consume for themselves. But what a huge portion of our economy is based on is exchanges between capitalists themselves. So you can have the exchange of productive commodities. It's the, you buy a computer and you use it at work. You buy steel and you make machinery to then create tools for mining, which then you use to create steel, to use to create tools, to create more mining. I mean, there's a whole realm of production which is really just aimed at expanding capital and not necessarily providing for human needs at all. The consumer side of the economy is, for me, I think the one thing that might recommend capitalism is that, we can produce a lot of cheap stuff that most people, at least maybe a widening circle of people, can afford, and that's the upside. The downside is that state of affairs isn't permanent, and the whole system is driven in a way to create inequality and crisis. But it's this production for exchange more than the production for consumption, because all human production is aimed at human consumption on one level or another. That's not the main thing. It's the fact that rather than production for use in a community, we're producing things that we want to get rid of, and the primary goal is profitability and through exchange.
Right.
Yeah.
So how would you define socialism?
It's difficult because there's different definitions. I don't really distinguish in my head between socialism and communism. What I would say is that socialism is the overcoming of a mode of production for exchange and the self-emancipation of working people. In other words, the working class would eliminate its own position. There would no longer be a class of people who had nothing to sell but their time as workers, and another class that would own everything or the means of production. And instead, we would compete with each other, maybe to be productive. The aim would be to have a society where the primary want in life is to contribute, to be not just a worker, but to be a fully engaged creative subject in the world that has some say over what's produced, what the direction of the collective humanity is going to be, but also a sense of yourself and your own creative powers.
Yeah,
but that's very abstract, maybe, but,
yeah. Well, it's really tough. I mean, people, I try not to subscribe to any one ist as a self-descriptor, but it's like some of these terms are helpful for a starting point, even though there's a lot of there's so many flexibilities within them. I mean, I always tell people, I'm like, look, anarchy itself, I mean, anarchy is a lot like ice cream. There's so many different flavors. You're going to find something you like, you know.
Right,
but
right.
But in socialism, very similar as well. I've said that if I had to describe myself as one thing, if you're like, well, pick one thing that you would say is closest to where you're at, I would say market socialist would describe me the most. However, that's not necessarily all encompassing, because what I mean by that is, you know, like, I think workers should own the means of production. However, you know, you can still have some individuals participating in, you know, the goods and services part of the economy. Like if Joe Schmo wants to start a restaurant, I don't think that's a bad thing. I actually think that's a good thing. You know, people want to innovate, they want to contribute something. And if Joe Schmo's restaurant sucks, it might not stay open. If it's good, it might stay open. However, you know, when Joe Schmo hires workers, they get a seat at the table. They, you know, they cooperate with each other and they get a voice. But where I don't think that, you know, a market socialism thing would work is in housing. I think housing should be totally orchestrated. It should be a human right. I am in principle against private property, although that's not a change I'm going to see in my lifetime. So it's not like that's something I'm very adamant about. But if I was starting a society from scratch, I don't think private property is something I would include in it. But
well, I mean, I'm right now, I'm wrestling in my mind as to whether to threaten to send you to Siberia or to make, you know, some sort of gesture of comradeship. I think what I'll do is the second thing and say, there's another definition of socialism, which is socialism is a transition between the capitalist order we know now and society where the maxim from each according to their ability to each according to their need would hold. So by that, so what I would say is that I can imagine that it is least plausible that on the way towards what I'll call socialism or a communist society, we might still hold with some kinds of exchanges which would seem like what we already have now. But I'm not against people running restaurants for people to come to and eat. What I'm opposed to is the idea that our productive work, the value of our productive work is measured in labor time and creates these commodities which are then valued based on the labor time, or their prices are in a roundabout way determined by that. So in other words, the problem with the exchange side of in the market isn't the market itself. It's the productive apparatus that's necessary and the social relationship that defines capitalism that's necessary in order for that market to obtain. You have to have a system in place where production is aimed at creating commodities which then kind of embody the amount of time, the average time spent working. And that requires there to be a class of people who have nothing to sell but their time as workers in order to create that kind of exchange in the market. So what I would like to see is a common hoard where in the market to have the kind of the quality where you go and you pick out things that you need or that you want to work with in order to contribute to society, but it's not a profit-driven market. But that's, you know, the long-term vision. Workers co-ops, small scale,
right.
Work, and maybe some nationalization under capitalism. Maybe all of those things could be steps on the road towards my more utopian vision.
Well, so what specifically is your utopian vision then?
Well, specifically, this is where it gets, I like to talk in big abstract terms. Specifically, well, I do have a dystopian vision, Bash Bash Revolution, in which capitalism is replaced by an AI. But the what I would say primarily my vision is that we would create forms of cooperation in production, which are based on cooperation and where the production is aimed at providing for human needs rather than aimed at producing this kind of abstract value that our profits come out of. I mean, it could be, and I think it's likely that even money would no longer be necessary in a socialist world. That there would be other forms of there might be other forms that we would use to determine our cooperation, but it wouldn't be something that we would spend in a market to get goods. We might have a social credit system that would give us the power to direct other people's activity, and say, okay, everybody has to come work on my project now because everyone's voted for this project, which I want to create. Let's say I want to explore outer space, so everyone has to lump in because everyone voted. So it's your turn to come make the microchips for the spaceship or something like that. So that would be my vision. My vision would not be a small vision. It would be a radical transformation of society.
Well, I started off my year reading. Have you ever read the book Debt?
Yeah, by David Graeber.
Yeah. He's an anarchist academic, right? Like that's kind of his background. Yeah, I started off my year reading that book, and I was just like, oh wow, like just so many little things in there that you just never think about as you just participate in society. That really breaks down, like the history of money and why we have it, and what exactly it does, and how it's like. I mean, just within the first couple of pages where he's like, look, as an individual, you have this, you're always taught this moral thing, like you owe your debt this like morality that you have to honor it. Yet that's not reciprocated at all, because debt is just this amoral thing that never goes away, no matter what happens on your end. And that's it's really absurd when you think about it. Yeah, it's really absurd what the banks were able to do. But we're born into this stuff. So we just don't, we don't really ask these questions. But then when you break it down, it's like, oh, there's got to be a better way to, in the most simple sense, there's got to be a better way to exchange.
Yeah. One thing that when I was reading Capital recently, because I have a Capital Volume 1 reading group, because I'm reading it again to try to understand it better. That really hit home was that gold under a capitalist system is a way to have social power and to hold on to the social promise of access and into the collective work. In other words, the reason people hoard gold is not because the gold in and of itself is so valuable, but because it works as a universal social promise that people will do what you ask them to do. It's a hoarding of social power. The gold. So the thing to understand about capitalism is that we conceive of the relationships in the market and the economic realm as being kind of objective and out there. Gold is gold; it has value. But really, it only has value from because of the social relationships that it engenders and that have produced it. So the person holds gold in order to ensure his social safety, right? And now we live in a world where capitalists spend their money in productive activity in order to grow their social power. And so rather than debt, I tried to think about as the only category. I tried to think about how, creating debt and also creating a surplus of gold, creating lots of profits are both forms of trying to hold on to social power.
Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. You can tweet me an article at Ron Placone. We'll go through it together and